Okay, we are still in chapter 14. We're going to discuss the 4 factors of group success and how they changed. Now, I do want to apologize that I didn't do a video on Gettysburg. I tried a few times, I recorded a few things, and the few times that I tried to chop it up and make it a little bit smaller, I was still about 25 minutes, and I was on slide 4 of 22. So it was one of those ones where I would need, those really long days that you guys all miss, one of those hour and 20-minute days. Yeah, I need one of those to cover Gettysburg. It's that expansive. It's probably, again, as I noted, probably one of the most written about battles in American history. I have 2 Gettysburg books alone in my personal library that are well over 500 pages each. One of them is a more narrative discussion where you have individual stories of people in the battle, and then I have a more technical breakdown of troop movements, action throughout the day, things that are a little bit more blasé to an average reader, but interesting to a historian. So, sorry about that again. Also, I just want to let you guys know that while you guys are taking your Civil War class in my university studies right now, I am also in a Civil War class too, except for mine's quite a bit different. All I am doing is finding a obscure topic in the Civil War and writing an academic paper on it. So it probably will take me another month and a half or so of writing before it's even ready. If any of you are interested at the end of the school year and want to read it, send me an email at some point and I will send you a copy of it once it's gone through its refining stage. It's kind of a fascinating little study. Anyways, let's jump right into here, okay? All right, so at the end of Gettysburg, this changes everything. Gettysburg, with the victory of the Union over the South, with Robert E. Lee being basically turned back and forced out of the North for the last time, it looks like things are going to change for the South, and they do, dramatically. So let's talk about the 4 factors, and we'll go over those here. First off, in the North, after Gettysburg, you see a wide change in overall training when it comes to Union forces. And this starts under McClellan. McClellan, for all of his faults, one thing that he was really great at was training troops. And once he was able to train a solid corps of troops, he then trained a solid corps of sergeants, which then in return, you get a solid corps of lieutenants, captains, colonels. Up along the line, eventually you have battle-hardened men who are well-trained on how to fight the war. So this is one thing that really shifts the advantages towards the North again. This time, no longer are they just with a bunch of volunteers who show up to the front line and get soundly whooped by Lee. Instead, they're battle-hardened men who know tactics, and they know battle formations, and they can listen to commands and not flee. So this is a big advantage that the North starts to get into. One of the things I like to talk about, too, is better weaponry. During this time frame is where you see the invention of like the Sharps rifle, which is, again, uses a shell instead of using a powder bag that you would tear and then drop a round into and ram it home. You also see innovations and advancements such as the Gatling gun, the repeating rifle. So you remember if you see an old Western movie where you start seeing repeating rifles, those start to show up on the battlefield, giving the individual soldier a greater amount of fire that they can put down range and can do more devastating damage per individual troop comparative to just with a musket-loaded rifle. So when you look at a capability in the North, this really starts to go in the North's favor, and the South, on the other hand, they start to lose it because they start to suffer immense number of casualties. If you were to look at casualty numbers typically throughout the Civil War, you'll notice that when there's large engagements, that more often than not, casualty numbers are fairly similar. And when I mean fairly similar, I mean you're talking 7,000 to 8,000 men who are either killed, wounded, or missing. Missing can be everything from they got blown apart from a cannonball and they can't find the rest of his body to they took off running into the night and were never seen again. So missing can kind of incorporate a lot of different scenarios. But one of the things, though, is that when you look at that balance, you have to understand, again, you look at the North, the population of the North is significantly larger than the South. So the North can absorb more casualties. Now, is that going to impact families up north? Of course it is. But by absorbing more casualties, I mean that per numbers of men lost, the North could take sometimes up to 2-to-1 losses on the battlefield and still come out ahead in terms of manpower. South, on the other hand, they could not take that devastation that continued to hit them. So as battles are going back and forth, the South is finding itself losing more and more troops through injury, death, and casualties. And then once that starts to happen, they have to start bringing more troops in through a draft system. And so once they start bringing those ones, typically those who show up in a draft are not committed to necessarily the cause. They've been told by the government it's time to go to war. The other thing that happens dramatically through the South is if you study these battles, you'll find that Southern generals and Southern colonels and even some of the captains and such, they have this very strong desire to lead from the front. And what that means is that they're willing to sit in the thick with their men to rally them and push them forward. Often, this was the difference between victory and defeat in some of the battles. Because if you have your commanding officer motivating you and pushing you forward, often these men are very charismatic and have the ability to build their loyalty with you, that you're willing to follow their orders. And what happens is that you have many of these men who are leading from the front that end up dying throughout these major battles. You have other ones like Stonewall Jackson that he gets killed accidentally by his own men. So you have a lot of major leadership major generals start to die or seriously wounded throughout the war. If you look at the Battle of Jefferson down in the South near the end of the Civil War, in one day they lose 6 frontline generals. So that goes to show you that the overall leadership starts to diminish because they don't have West Point anymore. They don't have access to West Point. They don't have the ability to train brand new generals that are as well trained as like Lee and Longstreet in order to fight in the war. And lastly, they were pretty much out of supplies, weaponry. The blockades were working effectively. Factories are not producing what are needed. Again, if you study one element about Gettysburg, is Lee had sent his army up there to find boots. I mean, that's how bad it had gotten in the South. There's other times where you read later on in the Civil War where the South actually disengages from battles because they run out of ammunition and supplies and they have no more. They can't just go back and go to their supply trucks and trains and be able to reload again. Unlike the Union, who have vast quantities of supply carts that are coming up behind it, supply wagons that are continuously feeding ammunition, food rations, and boots, very importantly, and new weapons to their soldiers as they are needed. So the South is suffering from lack of resources at this point. So their capability drops dramatically. And you start to see this lopsidedness in future battles between Lee and Grant. And that's one thing we're going to talk about right here in the leadership category. Lincoln, of course, still keeping the Union on track. He is, of course, going up against Copperheads and people who are who do not agree with the war's aims or war's goals. You start to see people grow dissatisfied. You see a strong Democratic group start to rise up and challenge Lincoln in the upcoming elections. So all is not quiet on the front, but Lincoln is still showing steady leadership. The other thing, though, is that Lincoln finally finds the commander that he truly wants, and that's Grant. He was very successful in the West, and Lincoln basically looked at him and said, this is a man who can fight and a man who can win. And Grant often had his own personal issues that people tried to deride him with and tried to force him out of command. One of the continuous charges levied against him is that he was a drunk and an alcoholic. Throughout the war itself, there's no signs of that. Grant is fairly level-headed throughout most of the war. Doesn't seem prone to drink during the time. One thing he is prone to do is he smoked cigars all the time. They said he always had an endless cigar. Every time you saw him, he had another cigar. Grant's also a very fascinating study when you look at just who he is. He's a very down-to-earth general comparatively. One thing that people always talked about is how he dressed on the battlefield. More often than not, they said he walked around wearing a private's uniform. The only thing you could tell usually how he was different was a couple of the stars on his shoulder. And it's just because he was kind of a homespun kind of person in his dress and style. He didn't like to be flashy. And so often they said when they'd go looking for him, it'd be hard to find him because he looked like everybody else, and instead of wearing a finery uniform that people could locate him with. And Grant he's very bold in his tactics and his strategies. And Grant all the time is derided as just how's the best way to say this? He's derided as just sending men to their death and trying to defeat the South with sheer numbers. And so meat grinder, that's what I was looking for. They were talking about how he was a meat grinder. He'd just take troops in mass formations and just shove them at Lee until Lee was so depleted of men that he couldn't fight anymore, while Grant was still getting large numbers of troops still back into his forces. And if you study some of Grant's tactics, in some battles that is the case. In other battles, he's tactically brilliant and does well against Lee. So it just depends on what historian you're looking at and how they view his military leadership style. Also, General Sherman, who had been with Grant in places such as Shiloh, also is appointed to a higher command position in the South, and he's tasked with basically coming from the West and annihilating pretty much anything in his path on his march to Atlanta. So Sherman is, I think I've talked about this before, Sherman is still well hated in the South because of his unrelenting nature when he was devastating his way through the South in order to obtain victory. There is a really good statue of him in New York City outside of Central Park. I believe it's on Fifth Avenue. It's quite pretty. I have a picture of it somewhere. But when this happens, this is where you start to see the North gain leadership advantages because Lincoln finally finds a soldier who doesn't pull from the battlefield. Instead, he pushes towards victory each time. In the South, you still have Lee. Lee's still successful for the most part against the North in many battles. However, again, the depletion of resources, manpower, and the ability just to wage war were not on his side, and eventually he starts to taking severe losses of his men. Pickett, like I talked about, Stonewall Jackson, both of them had died, and other major Confederate leaders have also perished on the battlefields or were wounded to the point that they couldn't continue on anymore. So with the loss of a lot of their top generals, they start to lack the skilled set of leadership that they need in order to pursue and at least even fight a successful defensive war at this point, because that's where they're at. Now they're just simply at a defensive war. With the resources, this is obviously, we've already talked about this. Their resources are still great, manufacturing large numbers of troops. One thing that they do have the advantage of is that their monetary system is strong. They have centralized banking. They can take loan. They can acquire debt. Other countries are willing to loan money to the North, and their manufacturing sector is strong enough that they're still being profitable. So, North is economically stable. One of the problems that they have, though, is you do have large numbers of desertions in the army, where you have people just up and leave in the middle of their enlistment. So they had to engage and put a draft into place, like the South had to, in order to increase the number of men that they had on the battlefield. In the South, Sherman basically devastates the South on his way towards the sea, and he annihilates everything. He annihilates farms, factories, cities, anything that's in his wake. And so the South loses more manufacturing capability than it ever gains. And so they just don't have the resources anymore. Their monetary system had just massive inflation. Their dollars were worthless. They didn't have access to the international markets. King Cotton was basically can't even be profitable because they couldn't ship it out. The South was having the same issue with losses of manpower. As the war got pushed further and further into the South, men often left the army to go defend their homes. That's what they saw as the new thing that they needed to defend. They're no longer fighting for their state. They need to make sure that their homesteads are safe. So they start to leave the army when it comes apparent that that's starting to lose. So one of the fascinating aspects, too, is that once the South starts to lose, they start offering black slaves freedom to fight for the South. So as you can see in that bottom corner, that's actually a group of Southern black troops fighting for the Confederacy. Really interesting. Fascinating study. I've read a few articles on it. I would recommend looking into a little bit more too, because it's just an interesting read about how you actually have black troops fighting for the South. All right, motivation. Well, after Gettysburg, the Union felt invincible afterwards. They felt like they really had the upper hand. They felt like they could continue to wage the war and obtain victories over Lee. Lee no longer looked like he was impervious to attack, and he was no longer in a position of invulnerability. Instead, the North had bloodied his nose significantly, and they continued to press the advantage, and they continued to bloody Lee's nose on the way back south again. Of course, like I said, you still have your anti-war protests, but people started to think that the war was starting to come to an end for once. So motivation still kind of moves towards the North. The South, again, they're ready to check out. A lot of their soldiers are. Their family, some of the soldiers have lost everything. They've lost their homesteads. They've lost their families. They've lost their farms. They've lost their jobs. They start to see that there's no reason to continue fighting in this war. So the South really starts to fall in upon itself. You still have the very motivated groups, though, that think that they can hold out in a defensive war long enough to finally just have the North have an election in 1864 and hope that a Democratic president would be elected that would then sue for peace with the South. That's what they were hinging a lot of hope on. And when it comes about and Lincoln wins again, that kind of is the nail in the coffin of the South at this point. All right, guys, that ends this unit right here. We're going to finish up the unit tomorrow, and then we're going to get prepared to study for the test, and we'll take the test on Friday, okay? Also, next week, you guys are also going to be taking your semester final, so we will prepare. I'll put together some PowerPoints for you guys to study. Make sure you study the map. The map was sent out way earlier back in Chapter 13, so make sure you go back and take a look at it. I'll try to post it again here in the next day or two so you can also study it then too. All right, guys, thanks again. We'll see you tomorrow.